Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I'm so glad this meeting is happening, and good to see you all here. And as usual, I'm going to start with a story about my old friend Jerry. He and I were sailing buddies for a number of years, and he had a boat, Insolvent. Brilliant name for a boat, Insolvent. Pun on British warships, intrepid, indomitable, and so forth, but also insolvent in the legal sense, and also in solvent in the water, and also in the sun, soul, and the wind. Well, so it was a great name for a boat, and I helped him sail it. And I'm going to tell a little tale that happened once when we were sailing it from Connecticut up to Maine. We crossed the Gulf of Maine, and it was the middle of the night. No, it was not at the middle of the night. It was coming up to dawn, and we were using a Swedish watch system. Never mind what that is, but I was on watch, and the light was just beginning to come up. And there was a period when you don't have color vision. And Jerry emerged from the companionway, come up to join me in the cockpit, and he was wearing his bright yellow foul weather gear jacket. And what struck me at the moment when he came up was a problem which I'm going to use to illustrate what I call a greased path to mystery. So it was just before dawn. Jerry emerges. I look at him. I see, of course, he's got his foul weather jacket on. It was not raining, but it was threatening. And here's the question that I had in my mind. Was I seeing that his jacket was yellow? Or was I just believing that it was yellow? I'd seen him wear it a lot. I knew the jacket well. And in that light, I couldn't tell. I could not tell. I was looking right at it, hard as I could, thinking about it, introspecting, paying attention. Was I seeing yellow or not? And I didn't know. I couldn't tell. And if you put yourself in the circumstance, you'd be in the same position. We have underprivileged access to our own conscious experience. I might have gone on and said, what? Or was my memory so strong that it painted my consciousness with a yellow qualia? But you don't want to go there. That's when you slide from a perfectly good question, a real question, into disguised nonsense. So I think. Let me say a bit more about the case. We know a lot about color vision. We know a lot about the rods and the cones and the role they play, and when you have color vision, when you don't. And all of this stuff you can learn. It's all third-person scientific knowledge. You can learn it about yourself. That's not what the question I was asking. I knew pretty much what the facts were. Well, this was way back in 1980 about, but and a lot has been learned since then about color. But I wasn't asking a question about exactly what in my brain was doing what. The question I was asking was the one that philosophers want to ask, namely, was I seeing yellow or not? Or did I just seem to myself to be seeing yellow? And could I tell the difference? And if so, how would I tell? And what difference would it make? So that's a topic that I want to address. I want to give you a sense of what that experience is. I'd love to take you all out on a sailboat and have you sail through the night and get up at dawn. Great experience, but this is a little easier. This is, I think, one of my favorite visual illusions. I take it you can all see the Necker cube floating in front of the black discs. How many of you can see the Necker cube on a black background through a piece of Swiss cheese? Can everybody see it? Are you sure? I'm going to make it real easy for you now, because this particular diagram is 4 ways ambiguous. There are many different ways of reading this. If it's floating in front of the black circles, now it isn't. But what I really wanted to show you is the yellow here, and ask you, are you seeing yellow behind the Swiss cheese? Do you see the yellow as all connected into that Necker cube? But are you painting in the yellow? Are you filling in the yellow in your mind's eye? I mean, this is not imagination. You're looking at it. And the question is whether you're seeing yellow where the cube is hidden behind. And the answer is probably no. But it's interesting if we go back to the white. Are you seeing sort of whiter than white when it's floating in front? And there's an actual explanation of that in terms of connections in the brain. There's a difference in the brain that is now pretty well understood, so that the difference, there's 2 different ways of seeing this better than Duck Rabbit. Seeing the cube behind the Swiss cheese, or seeing it floating in front of the black discs, and they're different neurophysiologically, and we can tell. There's ways of figuring that out. Now, one more case. You don't have any trouble seeing the multicolored cube behind the Swiss cheese. Where does the color change? If your brain had to put it in with metal paint, and there had to be some kind of a decision about where the purple turned green, or where the green turned yellow. Your brain doesn't need that. You don't have to render that. You just see that there's a multicolored cube. It's partly occluded behind the white screen with the holes in it. I guess the main point I want you to get from these examples is your own access. First of all, you know nothing privileged about what's going on in your brain when you're doing this. Anything you know about that, you've learned from textbooks or from going to laboratories, third-person science. You don't have any access at all to the physical properties of the events in your brain that are giving you the experiences you're having. You have no access at all to that. That, by the way, was probably the chief point I wanted to make years and years ago in Where Am I? Where you don't know, if your brain were secretly moved down into your chest cavity, you wouldn't know that it was there and not up here. The fact that you think your mind is up here is because it's behind your eyes and between your ears. So you have much less access, much less acquaintance, much less You have no privileged access at all to the machinery of your brain, any more than you do to your liver or your gallbladder. What you have is a highly reliable stream of content. But that, the nature of that, what its properties are, is something you may have some guesses about. You only have theories about that. You have no direct acquaintance at all with the nature of how you come to be able to tell people what it's like to be you. Now here's Ned Block. My gosh, this is more than 20, this is almost 30 years ago. P-conscious states are experiential. That is, a state is P-conscious, phenomenal conscious, if it has, that's my emphasis, not his, experiential properties. The totality of the experiential properties of the state are what it is like to have it. Do brain states have experiential properties? No. They don't. They represent experiential properties. They have properties, but they're not experiential properties. Or is it a little bit of both? That's what I'm going to try to look at. And I want to contrast this with a comically naive idea. And I know the game of straw manning and caricaturing the opposition is a mug's game that anybody can play. But I just want to remind you of how bad the following idea is, because I still find people that will clasp this leaden idea to their bosom and go plunging into the ocean, carrying it down with them. Compare old-fashioned cinema film to a DVD or a digital video file. The film represents red by having red pigment on each frame. You can hold it up and you can see the red. In cinema, red is used to represent red. In DVD, red is not used to represent red. The digital file represents red by having zeros and ones in various positions. Now, how is representation of color in the brain accomplished? It's not like old-fashioned cinema representation, right? I think that is an uncontested fact. It is not like that. The digital file represents red by having zeros and ones in various positions, by having, of course, that's in itself metaphorical. There are no zeros or ones. What there are micro dimples or magnetic micro differences or voltage micro differences. This is physically topic neutral. There's lots of different ways of representing red on a DVD or in a digital file. Many different media. The physical properties of the representation are irrelevant as long as the functional properties are preserved. That's why you can take a DVD and turn it into a CD and turn it into and send it over the internet. And what's maintained in each case is just information, nothing else. It's color by numbers. So how does the brain represent red? I think that everybody believes their brain represents red when you see red things. Well, it isn't by zeros and ones, almost certainly. It's by neural activity patterns one of my worst nightmares is that it might be glial properties. You know, you have 10 times more glial cells than neurons in your brain. And it's beginning to turn out that those are not just packing. They're not just little pillows. Maybe they're doing a lot of the work. Maybe if we knew the complete connectome of the neurons, all we'd have is the phone system. And it would be the glia that were doing a lot of the important work. Or maybe it's subcellular properties. That's what Randy Gallistel believes. But in any case, it's not pigment. And it's not figment. Figment was my deliberate term of abuse for the view that when you see something red, there's something in some way red, intrinsically red qualia in your brain. No. There is no reason to believe that at all, and many good reasons not to believe it. It's easy to understand how such digital representations do their work in paint by numbers, for instance. Or let's take a DVD, say. The function of all of those numbers on that DVD, all those microdimples, is to restore colors in some medium. That is, on an LED screen, on your phone, or on a color printed page, and they preserve the information and they get translated one way or another, and they produce pigment, or they produce colored light. They actually make something red. You can go from red to colored by numbers to red again. That's how DVDs work. It's how television works. It's how your cell phone color works. But it's not how your brain works. Those same color by numbers can be used to allow discriminations. For, my gosh, it's 5 years now, 5 years. Keith Frankish and I have been working on a project which we call the emancipation of the drone, where we imagine taking a drone which is teleoperated by a human operator, the way drones are, and we gradually replace all the activities, all the control structures of the human operator with onboard systems so that the drone becomes completely autonomous. Possible in principle? Yeah, absolutely. When you do that, one thing you don't need to do is to translate all those numbers into colors or qualia or anything like them. You don't have to do that because the drone doesn't have any eyes inside its head to look at colors, the way the human operator has eyes that are looking at the screen on the remote control. We have a little example. You make a drone that's flying over, Ukraine, as it might be. And we want it to be able, it's got bombs, but we don't want it to throw its bombs at ambulances. So some ambulances have a red cross painted on the roof. So we want the drone to be able to discriminate red crosses on white roofs when it sees them. Hard? Actually, no. No, that would be a pretty simple thing to make a drone be able to do. All you need is a color camera, and they already have those. And you take the digital signal and you use the digital representation of the color as the trigger for whatever consumes that representation, and uses it to veto the idea of dropping, say, a bomb on that vehicle moving along that bridge. The one thing you don't have once you make the drone autonomous they don't have any display screen anymore. There's no display screen needed because there's nothing with eyes that's looking at it. And that's where you'd need color. And there's no color in your brain. There's representations of color, but they're not in color. There is no color in your brain. Now, I don't think I've said anything controversial. Yes, I don't think. There's no need to render or restore the color in the drone the way there is. When you play a DVD, you filmed your kids on the beach today. That was color and was sensed by your cell phone, and now it's on your cell phone. And now you hit the button, and on your cell phone comes the colors, and they're right there on the screen. There they are. Thanks to the LED screen, the numbers have been used as a recipe for turning them back into color. But there's no such thing that happens in the brain. Okay. A simple digital detector in the drone's computer can consume, I like to use Ruth Millikan's term here, consume representations of color directly. That's the most useful form that they could be in. You'd just be wasting a screen and another camera and so forth if you tried to convert them back into color. Okay. Subpersonal systems in the brain can similarly consume whatever represents red in the brain and use that detection to direct all kinds of responses and responses to responses and responses to responses and attitudes and changes of mind and distractions and pains and all the rest. Now, the urge to posit figment is strong. That's why I've spent all this time sort of haranguing about it, because there really does seem to be figment. But there isn't. Just to make sure you realize how radical in a way this is, although I think it is simply common sense once you understand the physics behind it. Here we have my favorite example. I want you all to just stare at the fixation cross. Don't blink, don't move your eyes around. Stare at it, stare at it, stare at it. A few more seconds, please, everybody, please. And then now, what'd you see? You saw an American flag. Everybody see an American flag? Okay. Now, how many stripes on that how many red stripes did you see? Well, you probably can't count it right now, but you saw them. What red stripes am I talking about? Well, the red stripes of your complementary color acronyms. Where were they? No red stripes up on the screen here. No red stripes on the computers of the people who are watching this remotely. No red stripes on your retina. No red stripes anywhere. There are no red stripes. There just seem to be. There just seem to be. Well, how can that be? It can be that way because your brain represents red stripes using whatever physical system of representation it has. And that being the way that your brain registers when you do see red stripes, you're home free. It's just like the drone seeing the red cross on the roof. There are no red stripes. There just seem to be red stripes. The red stripes that you seem to see in this page are really illusory. How about the red stripes when you're looking at an American flag? Well, they're illusory too, in a way we'll get to. Those red stripes, where are they? What properties do they have? Where's Sherlock Holmes? What properties does Sherlock Holmes have? Is Sherlock Holmes made of fictoplasm? No, we don't need fictoplasm. We don't need dualism with regard to imaginary characters. And we don't need dualism or anything like dualism for complementary color after images. The red stripes do not exist. They just seem to exist. All right, now there's another side to qualia and the belief in qualia, and it's been mentioned several times, particularly by Katja in the last talk. I want to speak about the normative and moral dimension of all this. Oscar Wilde once said, "The cynic knows the price of everything and the value of nothing." That's a wonderful, wonderful phrase. Let you sort of take it in and think about it for a few seconds. It seems to be saying this, that money is just a convenient and imperfect tracker of real value. Real value. So anybody who confuses money with real value is some kind of a Philistine, morally degenerate, and generally failing to uphold something very important, maybe even sacred. Right? Well, is real value intrinsic? David Papineau thinks that Keith and I have a burden of explaining what we mean by intrinsic when there's a perfectly good and well understood and agreed upon sense of intrinsic that philosophers know and others. I'm going to challenge that, so I'm just putting David on notice now that I'm going to give him some red meat to chew on right now, if he would like to. Is real value intrinsic? Money, of course, has no intrinsic value. That's just everyday economics, right? But what about real value? If money has value only parasitically on the things that have real value, does that make real value intrinsic? What exactly would that mean? In fact, what is anything intrinsic? Now, this morning, we had from Keith a bunch of do's and don'ts. And now you're going to get another dose of that from Uncle Dan. Some of Uncle Dan's advice. Now, you may remember the Shirley Alarm, one of my favorite bits of advice. Some of you know about the Shirley Alarm. The Shirley Alarm is one of the intuition pumps, one of the little thinking tools I introduced in my book, Intuition Pumps. I see, every time you see the word surely in a philosophical treatise, a little bell should ring, ding! And you should pause and look and see if, in fact, you've just located the weakest point in the argument of the article or book that you read. And the answer is, and I've tested this out, yeah. Why? Because the word surely, it's a nudge. It doesn't go without saying. If it went without saying, you wouldn't have to say surely. So when you see the word surely, that's very likely where the cracks are being papered over in any philosophical debate. I've checked this out. I actually did a random check of a whole bunch of articles online using my handy search string searcher to find the word surely. And I went to several dozen examples of the word surely in philosophical papers, and not all of them, but most of them were, that's the place. If you want to dig, if you want to put your crowbar somewhere, that's a good place to look. It doesn't always work. It's just a rule of thumb, the surely. Okay. By the way, since then, in teaching my classes, on a number of occasions I've said surely, and some student in the room will go, ding. And we'll stop and think about it. It's try it, you'll like it. So here's another one. I haven't used this one before, but I'm going to use it now, the intrinsic alarm. I think the intrinsic is the same thing. When you see the word intrinsic, you should sniff, because very likely somebody is doing some hand waving. They don't know what they're talking about. Not always, but very often. One of my favorite examples of this is when people talk about the intrinsic awfulness of pain, as if there was this leaden lump of nastiness, intrinsic nastiness, and that's what pain really is. Nobody knows what that is, and why? How could it be awful if it was an intrinsic property? Pain is real and it's awful, but there's no such thing as intrinsic awfulness. It's awful because of what it does. It's awful because of the way it prevents you, when you're in pain, from doing the things you want to do. Its functional effects, its dysfunctional effects. Of course, it also has some functional effects. It teaches you to nurse that sore elbow of yours and not keep using it. If you try to extract a notion of intrinsic awfulness, which is independent of function from pain, that's a fool's errand. You're not going to find it. No such thing as intrinsic awfulness. Colors are real, but they're not intrinsic properties of things. I'm talking about public colors now. How about alexandrite? My favorite mineral. Well, gibeonite is another favorite mineral of mine. Gibeonite has these amazing patterns on it, which can only be produced by cooling 1 degree every million years, 1 degree Fahrenheit every million years for millions of years. And then you get these fabulous Widmanstraßen, stripes on them. So if you want something which is uncounterfeitable, get yourself a hunk of gibeonite and you've got something that wears its history on its sleeve. But alexandrite is also wonderful, because as the maxim would have it, it's an emerald by day and a ruby by night. In daylight, it's green. In incandescent light, it's red. What color is it really? It's a bad question. It's not any color. Colors aren't intrinsic properties of things. Not of apples, not of grass. And yet colors are real. Perfectly real. But they're not intrinsic properties. Dollars are real too, but they don't have intrinsic economic value. As an American, I've often been amused and sometimes embarrassed by naive Americans, standing in a shop in Paris or Brussels or London and saying, how much is that in real money? meaning dollars. As if dollars had intrinsic value and other currencies were only had functional value. They had value because you could exchange them for dollars. And dollars had real value. That is an interesting illusion. Americans in general have the sense that they have a sense of the intrinsic value of the dollar. That's why they don't have to translate dollars and cents into anything to get a good sense of what it's worth. But if you say it in euros or pounds sterling, they have to stop and translate it into real value, which for them is dollars. Now, I wrote a paper about this, oh my gosh, 21 years ago. How much is that in real money? And I introduced the technical term vim. Thanks, Latin word, vis, vim, power. Vim is the intrinsic value of the dollar. A lot of naive Americans think that dollars have vim. And here's a curious fact. The field of economics cannot explain vim. There's an explanatory gap. We have a hard problem for economics. It can't explain the vim of a dollar. Now, so much the worse for vim. Vim is an illusory property. It's not real. It's useful, but it's nothing for science to explain. There simply is no hard problem of vim. Or to quote it another way, Europeans are not VIMBYs. By the way, my friend Stan DeHaan and a few colleagues, when I wrote this paper, they had just published a paper in Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience called Cognitive Euroscience, where they actually looked at the difficulty that Europeans had when the euro was introduced, because of course at first they had to translate it all back into marks or francs or pounds sterling, and it took them a while to catch on to euros and to get a sense, a useful, illusory sense, a user illusion that they knew the intrinsic value of a euro. And then, of course, euros have intrinsic value now, right? No, they don't, but they seem to have intrinsic value if you're a user of euros. But I want to say a bit more about intrinsic. Goodhart's law should be well known by philosophers. It's been recently discussed by a number of people. If you don't know it, it's when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And this is a remarkably widely applicable law. One of the best cases I know is the time to treatment in emergency rooms. In hospitals in the UK, they needed a measure to see how good your emergency rooms were at getting patients into the care of an actual emergency room doctor. So they would start a clock when anybody walked in the door and measure the amount of time before they were seen by a doctor. So you know what happened? There were ambulances sitting outside for 20 minutes, half an hour, or an hour. They weren't letting the patients come in so that they could keep their time ratio down because they're funding and support dependent on it. So that's an example of Goodhart's law. When you take something which starts out being a pretty good measure, and then you game the system, it ceases to be a good measure. Another example, which is, I think, more important in some ways, is the Turing test. When Turing proposed the test, it would be a good measure. But since then, since the test that he put together requires deceiving people about whether they're talking to a human being or not, what's happened is that people have gamed the system, and they've built all these cheesy, phony, anthropomorphic, Disneyfied little whiz bangs to make people think they're talking to real people, when in fact they're talking to dumb chat bots or something like this, or to Siri. So what would have been a good test, the Turing test would have been a very good test if it wasn't for the fact that the Turing test was turned into a measure, and then people, of course, found all the shortcuts so that it no longer was a good measure. Now, why do I go into all of this about Goodhart's law and gaming the system? First of all, it's not just in human social interactions. Evolution is full of examples of Goodhart's law. I'll just mention one right off the bat. Masturbation. Think about it. Why does it exist? People are gaming the system. They figured out how to get the reward without investing in what the reward was there for in the first place. And there are many other examples. So here's my tentative definition of intrinsic. What is intrinsic is whatever is not well measured when Goodhart's law is invoked. In other words, it is what matters to a valuer. Notice that that's not intrinsic by the standard definition, because you got a valuer there, and the mattering is the effects, the functional effects on the valuer. That's what intrinsic means. It's whatever really matters to the one who cares. And that, I think, is about as good as we can do with the concept of intrinsicness. This was brought home to me many years ago over a fine bottle of Chambertin with Wilfrid Sellers, who said to me, Dan, qualia are what make life worth living. Wonderful remark. And there's an element of truth in it. But not because qualia are intrinsically valuable and make life worth living in themselves, but because qualia, or what we have instead of qualia, are the causes and effects that matter to us in all sorts of different ways. It's what brings mattering into existence, even. If qualia are what matter, then they are functionally specifiable. And so there is no explanatory gap. There is no hard problem, because whatever it is that the hard problem is supposed to be a problem about, it doesn't matter. If you've got qualia that are not functionally specifiable, then not having qualia makes no difference to you. So there is no difference, no moral difference, no personal difference, no difference in the way your life runs, whether you're a zombie, a philosopher zombie, or a really conscious person with real intrinsic qualia. That's figment. That's putting pigment on the film. So illusionism. There are two illusions. Keith was talking about this earlier. There is, first of all, a set of real and very useful user illusions. Now, it is my considered opinion as an old guy watching the younger generations growing up, that the younger generation are cool with illusions as things that are beneficial. The user illusion is a term, of course, from human-computer interaction, from the designers who make apps and software have devoted a lot of ingenuity, brilliance to making these narcissistic user illusions so that you only need to know what you need to know in terms that are readily understood. And you don't have to understand what's going on beneath the hood of your phone or your computer. That user illusion is your friend. None of you in this room, I'm pretty sure, could use a cell phone or a computer without those user illusions. You are utterly dependent on them for whatever you are able to do with a computer or a phone. And they are illusions. They're fictions. They are like graphic novels in some ways because they have visible on your screen. You have colors and little tan folders that you put files in and click and drag and all the rest of that stuff. And that is all metaphorical. It is a brilliantly designed for ease of human use. So those are user illusions. And the idea that illusions are bad, which is something that Tobias was saying, no, sometimes illusions are bad, but at least the younger generation is growing up realizing that user illusions, at least, are darn good. Let's make a better one. It was designed by evolution. And in one species, us, there's also, though, a harmful theorist's illusion. And that's the illusion that you have that there are qualia, which are intrinsic properties that you have direct access to. And that is a theorist's illusion. Only theorists are susceptible to it. And even very smart people like David Chalmers is susceptible to this theorist's illusion. Dogs are conscious, but they don't think they have qualia. They don't have a hard problem, and they don't have a meta problem either. And neither does anybody except philosophers when they're theorizing, and when they're theorizing ineptly and helping themselves to intrinsic properties and immediate access, and the rest of that a mythology. Keith quoted Michael Graziano before, and I'm actually, no, he mentioned him. I'm going to give a little quote, which I think is nice, from that paper that he and colleagues did in cognitive neuropsychology. Some of the more mysterious and non-materialistic notions, not mysterious, non-materialistic, but mysterious and non-materialistic notions about consciousness may derive from an inaccurate schematic model of mind that all people construct at an implicit level and which biases explicit thought. It is being hoodwinked by your own attention schema into thinking that there are certain metaphysical properties that you have direct access to. That's where the mistake comes. In other words, consciousness isn't what people think it is. Now, we've been over this several times. Do illusionists say that consciousness isn't real? No, we say consciousness is real, it just isn't what you're thinking about. I mean, I put a whole chapter in Consciousness Explained called Welcome to the Phenom to show people all the varieties of consciousness that are perfectly real, and I included some things that people in general didn't know about, and I wanted them to know about, and they were really amazing phenomena. That's all real. It's just not what you think it is. It's just not what you think it is. When you suffer from the theorist's illusion, which is different from the illusion that the dog has when it sees things as warm and cuddly or worth eating or smelling too good to be true or whatever. So I want to talk about two user illusions. There's the desktop user illusion, which I've already relied on your knowledge of. And it was designed by engineers to be a user-friendly set of metaphors that simplify narcissistic systems. The conscious experience user illusion has been designed by evolution by natural selection to be a user-friendly set of metaphors that simplify narcissistically. It's the same gadget in both cases. It's the same. These are both designed to do work for you. And it creates the manifest image. That's what Seller's manifest image is. It's the user illusion that evolution plus social cultural evolution has provided to make it easy for us human beings to keep life and limb together and not fall over cliffs, and tell friend from foe, and ripe apples from unripe apples and all the rest. And what we need to track are what Jimmy Gibson called affordances. In the ecological approach to visual perception, he wrote about affordances. Gibsonian affordances are opportunities, what the environment offers the animal for good or ill. A pigeon in the street of New York picking up a bit of bagel off a piece of newspaper. The newspaper has writing on it, but that does not afford reading to the pigeon. That's not one of the affordances for a pigeon, but for you, it is, especially if it said something that interested you on a topic that mattered, because you've got the English machine in your head. Perceptual motor systems are designed to discern and respond appropriately to affordances. And this goes for whether you're talking about bacteria or planaria or fish or trees or grass or people. A simple way of thinking about affordances is this. Wouldn't it be nice to just to perceive the things that matter, not have to think about it hard and make inferences? And in fact, the people at Google have wasted probably $1 billion with Google Glass trying to create the Internet of Things, which would do just that, which would provide you directly through the eyeglasses that you wore that were connected with the internet with identifiers of all the things that really matter to you. In the future, you may be able to wear a device or implant one that labels everything in the world that matters to you. I'm going to come back in a moment to this idea about whether you wear the device or implant it. If you wear the device, if it's glasses, then you're going to have color to go in and irradiate your retinas and tickle your cone cells. If it's implanted, you don't have to render the color at all. You just go direct to the representations that the brain uses. Skip the color altogether. You can have a user interface, which is not a visual user interface, or an olfactory, or an auditory user interface. So here's a picture. City street, crowd crossing the street. Wouldn't it be cool? Supposing you really want to find a lawyer. Wouldn't it be cool if you could just recognize immediately who the lawyers were, if any, in this picture? You can't. Google Glass could make it so that you could. What do lawyers look like? Is there a lawyer look to lawyers? No. Here's a bunch of lawyers from recent American past. They don't look much alike. Nature has not provided us with any clear-cut, readily identifiable marks of a lawyer. But Google Glass could do that. And it could say, just mark them. Like, there, oh, she's a lawyer. As she walks along, Google identifies her and just writes the word lawyer right on it. And he's a pickpocket. Might want to know that too. For slightly different reasons. Wouldn't it be cool if you had such a thing to aid in your dealings in this hectic, helter-skelter, time-pressured world? It would be cool. In fact, I'm suggesting rather than words as labels, you might have a yellow L for lawyer and a skull and crossbones for pickpocket, or choose the symbols of your choice. And remember, if it's an implanted device, you don't need the symbols, you don't need the color. You just need some other marker. Zeros and ones, if you like, a little signature. That's all you need. You might get so used to this user-friendly innovation that if you lost your device, you'd feel you've been struck blind. And indeed, nature has already done this. That's what the manifest image is. It's a whole bunch of markers for things that matter, made readily usable by us, consumable by our brain circuits, and you don't need any intrinsic properties. You don't need any quality to do that. Reality is an illusion created entirely within the human mind, but it's the only place you can get a decent cup of coffee. Appeared in the New Scientist a few years ago, and it sort of nicely sums up this view of the manifest image. In order to control responses appropriately, the brain must identify, track, and represent affordances, but need not render the affordance in any new medium. Affordances are not properties of internal renderings, they are properties discerned in the environment. Properties like liquid and red and hard and shaped like a fish. These are properties of things out there in the world that the brain is good at detecting, tracking, and responding to. And they don't have to be duplicated in your brain or your mind, if you're a dualist, for this to happen. The desktop user illusion is rendered in pixels of color on a screen, as I mentioned, because it's going to be looked at by a pair of eyes. The consciousness user illusion isn't rendered in anything. The properties of the labels that matter, that make a difference, are the functional properties by which they are discerned and tracked by the next step in the neural process. Those are the properties that matter. No doubt there is a medium of representation in your brain, but your access to the medium is underprivileged. You know almost nothing about the properties of those media. One of its functional properties is putting you in the state of believing you are seeing a red stripe. The way the drone sees the red cross on the ambulance route. Now, this idea has a fine history in history of philosophy. Go back to Jack Smart's 1963 classic paper, Sensations and Brain Processes, where he introduces the term topic neutral, by the way. When we say I have an afterimage, we cannot mean something of the form, I have such and such a brain process. We don't know anything about that. There is rather, There is something going on which is like what is going on when I have my eyes open, am awake, and I see a fly. Way back in 1963, Smart nailed it. That's all you know. There is something going on in me that is like, you have the capacity, the competence to recognize a similarity, and you have no idea how you're able to do that. You don't have any access to the process at all. And if you think you know it by directly inspecting phenomenal properties that are made available to you, that you have access to, that's just a myth. It's a useful myth, as Keith was saying earlier. Phenomenological language is a very useful way of talking about things, but it is not getting at the metaphysical reality. Oh, horrors. Am I saying this? There's nothing red anywhere? You just think that there is? Well, let's pause. Thinking that there is something red no more involves something red than saying that there is something red does. Even when you're looking right at it and seeing it as clear as day. Now, I was thinking that Jerry's foul weather jacket was yellow. And I was looking right at it. Said, Jerry's yellow jacket. And no doubt in my brain, all sorts of things were going on that were responding to my identification of it as yellow. I was being primed, if you like, for yellow, even though my cones were not giving the signal for yellow. Well, what is the difference between just idly thinking that there are red things and thinking that you're seeing something red right now? There is a difference. Nick Humphrey has an answer in his book Sensation. And amazingly, as Keith mentioned this one, he thinks that only birds and mammals enjoy sensation. He draws a sharp line there, and I think he's almost right. But gradualist that I am, I refuse to follow him on this path. Although he's right that mammals and birds have profoundly different consciousness from reptiles and other invertebrates and invertebrates. He's right about something, which I'll try to describe. So here's a little experiment I want you to do right now. Close your eyes and imagine as vividly as you can that somebody wearing steel-toed boots kicks you in the left shin as hard as he can. Are you ready? Now, do it. Yeah. Everybody do it? Now, I want to know, do I owe an apology to anybody? Did I cause anybody any pain? Did I? Nobody's crying. Nobody's screaming. Was that mean of me to do that? Was that an evil act on my part? No. Because what you did, imagining that pain, was not the same as pain. So we're about to get on that greased slide to mystery if we don't look out. Done this. Okay. Imagining pain is not the same phenomenon as feeling pain. What's the difference? Imagining red is not the same phenomenon as seeing red. What's the difference? Imagining a red stripe is not the same phenomenon as believing that you are seeing a red stripe now. Right now, I want you, please, to recall in memory and in your imagination seeing the red stripe of the American flag that was up on the screen, or that seemed to be on that screen, half an hour ago. You can do it. You can. Most of you can. Maybe some of you are aphantasics and can't. But that's different from the actual, I could go back to that slide, we could do it again, and then you'd see the red stripe, the non-existent red stripe again, and that's different. I'm granting it, it's different. What is the difference? We have to look at functional properties. Back to the drone, discriminating the red cross. Now imagine that the drone doesn't just discriminate the red cross, but does this, and it's a fancier drone, it has reflective noticing. It notices that it notices this. And maybe it even has a sort of language of thought, and it says to itself, maybe in English, lo, another red stripe, another red cross, another ambulance. And it might then wonder, wait a minute, seem to be seeing a lot more red crosses on white vehicles these days. I wonder if they're all really ambulances. And that could lead in all sorts of directions. Now imagine a red cross drone with a red cross with noticing the alarm sounding and taking high priority action, or seeing the red cross distracting the drone, bothering the drone, upsetting the drone. These are among the gazillion effects of seeing a red stripe or a red cross that you or I are susceptible to, and that's that distinguish us from that simple drone and from simple insects that have color vision, for instance. It's not figment, it's the versatility and complexity of the responses that are enabled thereby. Apply the same reasoning to human perception. You don't just go in a state of red stripe discrimination. You notice this, the illusory red stripe you think you see captures your attention. This sets off voluminous reactions that percolate through your brain, your limbic system, your periaqueductal gray, frontal cortex, you name it, the whole story. Those were those loops and loops in Keith's diagram this morning. There's no role for mental paint in the processes that get this to happen. But in spite of my abusive term figment, Ned Block thinks there is. Or at least he seems to think there is. Here he is in recanting somewhat. In an earlier paper, he wrote about mental paint. And then he wrote this in 2010. I'm not assuming that if there is mental paint, it is non-relational, intrinsic, or has no representational aspect. Since I favor physicalism, I allow that mental paint may be a relational neural property. To avoid misunderstanding, I do not claim that there is anything red or round in the head when one veridically sees a red or round thing in the world, or as when red pigment in a painting represents a red bar. Good for you, Ned. He doesn't believe in figment after all. What he believes in is virtual paint, which is a perfectly fine concept. There are indefinitely many sequelae to seeing an illusory red stripe, but no rendering, no mental paint, but what may be useful to think of as no mental paint as virtual paint. What on earth is virtual paint? Well, what's virtual glue? Donald Knuth, the hero of computer programmers, The Art of Programming, Donald Knuth, classic book. He invented the TeX system for setting particularly scientific notation, scientific formulae and proofs, mathematical proofs, and so forth. It's a brilliant system he invented for use in writing and printing scientific papers. And he invented, the way he did it was he used virtual glue. He put all the symbols in little imaginary virtual boxes and put a little dab of virtual glue on the side of each box. And then he put them all together, and then he could virtually, this was elastic glue, could stretch the virtual glue in different ways until it looked right. You know, move the letters up here and over here, and you you get your equations looking right, you get the kerning and the coining and all of that just the way you want it. So a brilliant system that relied on a brilliant user illusion, the user illusion of virtual glue. Hard to imagine how he could ever have written that fantastic program if he hadn't come up with the idea of virtual glue. It's not real, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, it's not physical, it doesn't have any physical properties of any interest. It's a purely functional thing. And that's what virtual paint is in your head. And we're learning something about what it is. This oversimplification permits the control system, our control system, to play the role of captain. Creates a virtual governor created by the interaction between a crew of lesser agencies. It's not innate. It needs to be learned. And by the way, it's a byproduct of learning to speak. Your capacity to tell what it's like to be you is in large measure the product of your personal history of learning language and learning, where does it hurt? Your mother says, what kind of hurt is it? And you gradually learn how to use these words. It's not an innate talent. You have no innate perfect access to it. Your access can be improved. Thanks for your attention.